Anomalies. Anomalies.
Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows.
Anomalies.
This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
This is Anomalies.
Dave, how are you doing tonight? We're here with another episode of Anomalies. We've been doing this quite a while. I was looking on the website the other day, and it seems like we've been at this about 10 years, or does that make sense?
2010, I believe, was the first interview. And it was me, you interviewing me.
Well, hey, you got to start someplace. A lot of our discussions, and I think it's a function of living in the Pacific Northwest, has to do with Sasquatch. That's our state. It's not a state bird, but it's a state mammal. So I've always been fascinated by Sasquatch. But even more so, another cryptid that has always appealed to me has been the Mothman. And as you know, we're very fortunate to have an expert, I would say, on that story in the Mothman, Bill Grabowski, on the program tonight. Bill, we're going to welcome you on board. You doing okay tonight?
Well, I'm on the right side of the ground. I'm talking to you guys.
Yeah, that's
everything's got to be good.
Okay. So Dave and I are just kind of go back and forth here with you, and feel free to talk about, answer the questions, or throw in other material that you want to talk about. So one thing I'm interested in is how you got started as a writer, because the book that we're going to be referring to tonight, Black Light, that's just one of the things you've written. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, that's so far, at least for a book with my name on it, that's my only official nonfiction book, and the only one I've written that covers anomalies, weird stuff like Mothman, UFOs. There's a bit in there about electronic voice phenomenon.
Yeah.
But I would say the meat, the bulk of the book covers Point Pleasant, Mothman, Men in Black, which a lot of people are interested in, and sometimes the Men in Black thing, I find that more disturbing than any possibility of a cryptid sighting or a ghost. The Men in Black thing, which we'll get into, I'll happily discuss that. That to me opened up the whole Point Pleasant thing. Like, why did this happen there, and why all these different things? You couldn't make it up if you tried.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, as far as getting into writing, I scribbled a lot when I was a teenager. Just I don't know. I was into a lot of weird German electronic music, like Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, Hawkwind, British band, and that kind of, I don't know. I guess that was the way I linked with other people, was just by music. And as a teenager, music and partying, huge part of your life. Well, for a lot of us anyway. I don't want to brush everybody with that same color, But I went to Kent State University, another site of tragedy. My college English professor told me, you seem to be, do you write outside of this, or are you just trying to get through my class? And I said, no, I started writing short stories and things like that. She said, you're good at this. You should pursue. If she didn't say like, oh, go full time, and this was 1976, so no internet, anything like that. Just word of mouth, reading books. So I took that heavy compliment very seriously. I started maybe I should try writing things and selling things, and I didn't sell anything until 1983. Probably hundreds of rejections, but that's normal for a lot of writers, because it's not just, okay, I have a great idea, let's write this down, and boom, they're going to buy it. Well, not necessarily, because then you have to work with editors who usually, if they like your vision at all, they'll go, okay, you've got my interest. but you need to, tweak a little here, tighten these nuts and bolts. And then the biggest thing I've found is that the discipline of it, that's easily half the job right there. Is you've got to keep doing it constantly. It's like it's a cliche, but it's true. It's like lifting the weights. Like if you stop, even after you get in shape, if you stop, you'll lose that tone and everything after whatever, a few months or so. But that's how I got started. Aside from more directly, I had a weird experience when I was 10 years old.
Yeah, the paranormal penguin. That's what I've been waiting for.
Yes, as George Knapp, coined it. Although based on how I described it, because I was a 10-year-old kid, and my father had built a changing shed in our backyard. We had one of those chintzy above-ground aluminum pools. This would have been 1968. A very hot day, and I just wanted to go back there, and but parents weren't so safety obsessive back then, and I was a good swimmer anyway, so I was going back there, and behind the shed, I looked and was just I was too shocked to even react to this. I'm just looking like, what am I seeing? And it looked like if a penguin could be totally black and had a long pointed beak, almost like a hummingbird. If you've ever seen pictures, it's that straight needle-like beak. And I'd say 3.5, 4 feet high, and just standing there, looking at me. And of course, I freaked out and turned around and ran, and what was very upset, mostly what I remember is what it looked like and how I felt, and my mother's face when she saw me when I ran into the house. Because I'm certain she thought that someone probably tried to molest me. She was like, "Calm down. What is wrong with you?" And I had some water. I had some more water, and then years later, I found out that this is supposedly a side effect of some people who have the very close-up encounters, like UFO sightings that might involve some kind of a heat effect, or any other of a very close encounter, like a sighting, an entity sighting, that one of the so-called symptoms of that, whatever they saw, whatever it was, is extreme thirst. So that's weird. And then that was a first experience of a so-called physical side effect, so I knew something happened to me. I couldn't be sure what it was. I didn't want to think about it. So my mother came out there and looked around, and it's a bright summer day, a very warm day. There's no one there, and she didn't put me down. My mother was born in England, so she was kind of a reserved person. But when she got interested in something, she would not, she wouldn't just sit back and be shy about it. She came out. She went out there by herself. I couldn't go back out. I didn't want to. So that did spark eventually my interest in the paranormal. I didn't want anything to do with it until I got older, and the trauma of that was always still there. I guess that probably explains a really huge interest in science fiction movies, horror movies.
Right.
And I recall, like, I'd be afraid to watch it, but I'd watch them.
Mm-hmm.
But in the background, there would always be this sort of ticking away of either trying to remember something or not wanting to remember something. But it was an uneasiness with the subject matter, especially shows like The Outer Limits, the ones
Outer Limits, yeah,
the original, the ones who took the genre seriously, where there was genuinely, maybe not compared to today's standards, but there was a freakiness, and the people who wrote and directed those episodes took it seriously. If they wanted to scare you, you probably were going to be afraid.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, aha, this is funny, no one believes this. They were like, oh no, what if this actually happened?
And it's a psychological fear too.
Yes.
As opposed to just the jump scare or the gore. It's the horror movies and those stories that get into your head. I think that's going to lead sort of into you're talking about the Men in Black there's that psychological aspect of messing with your head that is the most disturbing feeling in some of the weird stuff.
Easily, because I mean, everybody on the planet, you know, probably one of the prime fears is losing your mind.
Right.
And right behind that is, well, what if I already have and I don't know it?
Yeah.
Because then that, if you really, you know, deconstruct that down to its lowest level, it becomes an animal thing, a survival thing. And if you lose that, you know, is it possible to lose it and not know that? Mm-hmm. Then you're questioning. This is what another thing that got me interested in John Keel's work was. At times, he seemed to be a lot more interested in examining what's actually reality. You know,
right?
Because everything we perceive is filtered through our senses. Now, does that mean that's what it really looks like outside of us? Well, we can't really know that. We have, you know, scientific instruments, cameras, you know, sound and all that. Yeah, that picks up things, but still, it's still us interpreting. And Mothman, everything that happened there, especially almost more so than the entity, was the Men in Black phenomenon. And above all that, or behind it, going on in the background was the MK Ultra, CIA experiments, and that whole, almost indescribable series of events, experiments on people with drugs, electromagnetivity, It's I don't know if there are other writers who have mentioned this before. They probably have. That I think what happened in Point Pleasant, which began, you could say it began with the first Mothman sighting, so-called, in 1966. But there were UFO sightings prior to that that I only found out about when I actually went there and talked to some of the older, like the original witnesses. Mm-hmm. And it all kind of like flared together. And once I started actually reading through the Senate committee on MK Ultra, it took place in 1975. It's called the Church Committee, an Idaho senator.
Yeah, Frank Church from Idaho.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Are you guys both in Washington now?
Yeah, we're in Olympia.
Yeah.
Olympia, right.
But Dan has spent quite a long time in Boise not Boise, Pocatello, right? And
in Moscow. That's where I went to graduate school. Yeah, so Frank Church was a big name in Idaho politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I also did some background on him just to know more, because I can't stop thinking about these things for good or ill. But the Church Committee, you should download the transcripts. You can read that whole thing. There's Edward Kennedy asking questions to CIA officials like, well, were you aware that you were dosing people with incredible levels of LSD in San Francisco? And these guys are waffling, and then some of them are just right out, like, chillingly cold in their answers, but they're telling the truth, as it turns out, about, well, we had to know how this would affect someone who was unaware of being either, dosed with some drug, and the one thing that stands out, among a lot of things that should stand out, is that there was electromagnetic testing, how a field would affect human consciousness. Mm. And there are suspicions that, well, a number of people killed themselves who were involved with the MK Ultra, because they, obviously they just thought, well, am I insane? What's going on with me? And became, they couldn't control their emotions. And then, the Church Committee brought this all to a head in 1975. And, it's the CIA is not supposed to be, it's not permitted to conduct operations in the United States, which is not a thing a lot of people know. They're supposed to be overseas, even though they're headquartered here in the United States. Mm-hmm. But at the Church Committee really brought that to a head. You're hearing, you're imagining people taking their glasses off, going, "Would you repeat that? You did what? To whom?" Yeah. And that the one poor individual jumped out of the window after he was dosed with LSD. I should have written his name down, but the fact is that happened. His family didn't even know for years and years what happened to him, exactly what happened to him. But yeah, the church committee opened up the MK Ultra thing, and I started. MK Ultra itself as a project began in 1953 and supposedly shut down in 73. And right in the middle of that period is the first Mothman sighting, the Men in Black sightings, and those all came to an end, as Keel said, 13 months to the day, December 15th, 1967, when the bridge collapsed in Point Pleasant, Silver Bridge.
Silver Bridge. Mm-hmm. Did you ever have anything paranormal happen to you after the weird-looking penguin kind of thing that you saw when you were 10?
Well, years later, in my early 20s, outside of being a drummer in local rock bands, this one pal of mine, John Fisher, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, he was a guitar player. We started getting into telescope building because we were interested in astronomy. Not astrology, mind you, astronomy.
Astronomy, right?
Science. And so with the help of my father, we built this massive Dobsonian telescope. I think we used a water softening tube. It was a 12-inch diameter, massive. So we're just, we're looking at things, and we're seeing what we found out were satellites. And not almost everyone has seen a satellite. It's just a solid dot moving across the sky. And if you don't know what it is, you're going to be going, what could that be? Because it's not, it's not a meteor, because those are just a second or two of flash. And we started seeing satellites, and then we started talking about, well, what do you think it would be like to see an unidentified flying object, a UFO? We both were already, horror movie freaks, science fiction freaks, and we just didn't know. You'd react like anyone. But I think John was the first one to start reading John Keel. And then when I started reading John Keel, Mothman Prophecies was the first thing I read by him, and that came out in 75. Once I started reading that, and there was an account in that book about these workers near Point Pleasant, and it's like construction workers, and they had a sighting of an entity that they saw of a tree. And you could tell from the way it was reported that they were embarrassed to talk about it. And therefore, to me, that brought it more to life. If someone really doesn't want to talk about something, you can tell.
Yeah.
But if they talk about it anyway, that means they're really afraid, and they want that out to know, okay, we don't know what we saw, but here's what it looked like. And they described a man-shaped figure, about 6 feet tall, with a brownish gray color. And reading more and more about Keel, that brought back this sighting that I had when I was a kid. And at first, I didn't really know what was going on with me. I started having nightmares about it, and I realized it all came back to me. I remembered the sighting of whatever this out of place bird was, or I didn't know. And then I discovered Whitley Strieber talking about screen memory.
Screen memories.
And I had to stop right there and consult actual psychological literature. I'm like, okay, I don't want to know any more about this. I want to know what psychologists say about this. And sure enough, they brought up, it was trauma and screen memory. And they were describing like Vietnam vets and things of that nature who had obviously seen horrendous stuff over there, and how they reacted to the trauma. And that was before PTSD was called PTSD. And after reading these things, I'm like, I think that may have happened to me when I had this sighting, regardless of what it may have been. But, a 10-year-old kid doesn't know about screen memory or, gee, how can I cover this up for my mother? It was a weird looking, a bird-like figure. And that's how I described it to George Knapp. Like it reminded me of a penguin, but there was a stillness to it, an intensity to it that didn't seem animalistic. An animal is not, a dog will look you in the eyes, which may or may not be a good thing. But, like hold your gaze.
Mm-hmm.
But this thing, again, whatever it was, this penguin-like creature seemed, there seemed to be like an intentionality for it just to be there. And, you know, for good or ill, that's all I remember. I remember the fear of it, the fear I felt, the terror I felt, and what it looked like. But then when you read about the unreliability of memory,
Right.
like they can ask someone, like car accident victims, they're like, okay, you're a good thing, you're alive. What color was the car?
I remember.
You know, they'll go, it was black, it was a Voyager. And then a person who was in there, they're going, no, what are you talking about? It was a small little foreign car. And then, you know, to yourself, you're like, no, I know. People always say, and what I've heard elsewhere, I know what I saw.
Mm-hmm.
But, and you don't want to refute them, but you don't always know what you saw.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, that's kind of where the context I put my sighting into is, I don't know really what I saw, but I know how it affected me. Which is another learning point from Keel. I think he was one of the first. He and Jacques Vallée about why don't we just examine or investigate the witnesses and how it affected them, not necessarily try and figure out, well, you saw this light, you saw this weird entity. Let's just see, how did this affect you? And that really flipped around ufology and paranormal investigation. I mean, it was a long time ago, but still, it's influenced to this day how people approach these things from the, you know, the exploratory side.
And it does makes sense. Sorry, I just want to bring this in because I think it's a very important observation about the UFO phenomena, especially, but also all these other cryptids and sightings of whatever you want to call them, fairies or gnomes or elves or just these critters. There's you know, there's obviously something where our brains are trying to deal with something that it can't deal with very well. It's
Yes.
encountering something new, evolutionarily, you know, or just something that it can't make sense of for whatever reason. But you also have the other aspect, I think, is that these entities potentially have motivation to cloak themselves. So you may be getting obfuscation from your own mind, but also from the mind of the entity or the, you know, whatever its energy it's putting off. So it's no wonder these encounters are so hard to even pin down on the what did you see. You know, even multiple witness cases, especially with UFOs, you just get a whole bunch of different seemingly random sometimes observations. I think that's why this has remained in the realm of, you know, mystery and unfortunately ridicule, because we can't even get the most basic agreement on some of these things.
Yeah, that's
talk about that a little bit. Or Dan, go ahead. I know you had a question there.
No, I want to hear what Bill has to say.
Yeah, I didn't. The whole thing that stands out in my mind about sightings and how people, let's say, process those,
Mm-hmm.
it's overwhelming. It's just like an accident victim. It's perceptual overload. It's emotional overload, and when you know, the brain just goes into survival, and then, you know, memories go here, physical sensations go here, and then when the person tries to recall it, they have to re-experience the trauma.
Mm.
And there's so many filters between, you know, like I was trying to just deal with before, that trying to unpeel those, like, okay, was this an authentic perception I had here, or is this just based on, you know, a surge of adrenaline and being overwhelmed, or, you know, what is reality? Is there a way to even gauge that? And there are a lot of very smart people working on that. There's a writer named Eugene Thacker who talks about the world for us, the world with us, the world without us. And he talks about, I think it's called speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, highfalutin terms. But he's actually a person trying to break down, okay, how do objects relate to the real world, how do we relate to objects. And then when you add on like, unidentified flying objects or UAPs with, are all kind of too many terms. When that comes into play, then you have to deal with, mistaken, like people, like Venus, for instance. If you actually know what Venus is and look at it when it's at its brightest, the only two things in the sky brighter are the sun and the moon. And Venus has been reported, as you both probably know, as a UFO.
UFO. Mm-hmm.
Policemen have chased it. 2 of them in my home state, Ohio. Actually, only like about 5 hours, about 5 minutes from where I grew up. It was a famous case, and the 2 policemen. This happened like a year before my incident, and strangely enough, though, the one cop started to flip out, and he just left his wife, and he took refuge in the Solon Motel, which was my hometown. When I read that case, I'm like, oh my God, like what happened to those poor guys? And it's speculated that they saw Venus because all the astronomical data has been looked into, as far as you can look into it. And they were driving towards Pennsylvania. They went over the Pennsylvania line, and they eventually stopped there. And state troopers had heard about that, and so they were out in Pennsylvania. And so it came down to the Pennsylvania cops going, well, no one here reported this moving object. And the cops were like, well, we chased it. And I think even in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that was dramatized, where the cop is following the UFO and he goes over the guardrail.
Yeah, I remember that scene.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it may have been referencing that case, but there are other ones where police, followed strange lights and found out later, well, it was an extraordinarily light search beacon seen 20 miles away on a helicopter. That will look strange because then you can't hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, silence is always a big factor in a lot of UFO reports, like those huge black triangles in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
Where people are going, what am I looking at here and there? Maybe you've seen it. There's great video of one of those, the Hudson Valley River sightings, where you can see, which is clearly a triangular shape with lights in the corners. There's no sound, and I know it's easy to doctor audio and, well, these days everything.
Yeah.
But those triangular sightings, those were interesting because I actually got into a little bit of a phone argument with Stan Gordon, who he's written about Bigfoot in Southwest PA. It's 1973 sightings, and he was saying, no, these black triangles, these are not terrestrial craft. And then I just kind of lost and said, how can you even think that when there's a vehicle called the TR-3A, which it used to be a classified aircraft until everybody blabbed about it, I guess. And they're saying it's a troop carrier. It's used to carry troops, okay? It's not anything really exotic, which probably is not that true if what they claim about military technology is supposedly 15 years ahead of the current time.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's classified for a good reason, because if the enemy can build some weapon that we already have, and that excuse was used during the MK Ultra investigation about, well, why were Americans testing on Americans these horrible drugs and weapons? And the comeback always was, well, because if the Russians get this or they get it, we have to have a way to react to it, which on one hand is valid, but there are ways to use volunteers, I guess. But in some of these experiments, they were just like, well, the subject might not even survive. But when they compared that importance to so-called national security, that was just, well, they're expendable.
Mm-hmm.
It's a slippery slope. I think we can all agree that
It is.
leads to, and that's the stuff that we know about. If we know about it, that there are things that are 100 times worse that we can't even conceive of with the, $300 billion black budget allotment, at least according to guy who wrote the NSA expose. I can't remember. I've got his book.
Oh, right. I may have this book. I'm not going to go up and get. I'm looking at The Shadow Factory by James Bamford.
It's Bamford for sure, but yeah, that might be it. I think it was another one. But anyway, the point is, yes, he estimated it at 100 or 200 billion, I think.
Yeah, some incredible figure.
Yeah, which is just a phenomenally huge amount of money that Congress signs a blank check and, looks the other way, and that's what's going on. So the things that we see that seem incredible, like Tuskegee or MK Ultra or whatever, the study of the psychics. I can never remember what that was. That Stargate or
Stargate, I think.
You're right.
Stargate. But anyway, the things that seep through to the public, which seem incredible and sometimes very abusive and of power, that there's stuff that's mind-bogglingly unethical going on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because
special access projects and all that.
Right, and MK Ultra had it's like, there's so many sub projects, and problem which even now is a huge problem. Let's just say it is that the government subcontracts, and it could be just some corporation. Like I was talking about this, or let's say arguing about it, debating about with Stan Gordon about the black triangles. I'm like, these are just unacknowledged black projects, and unfortunately they're flying over populated areas. And I had to give him that point. He's like, if that huge triangular aircraft really existed, do you think they would actually be testing a prototype over a populated area? I said, no, they'd be flying it over at Nellis. And I think some of the earliest sightings came from exactly that area where you would expect them, because even though they're way out in the middle of nowhere, there are gonna be overflights, even from people who manage to get close enough with binocs and all that, super high powered binoculars. They see things, and if you can relax enough and think about it, well, what do they do? They develop weapons, aircraft, and the things. The technologies that are really exotic, they're going to look mighty strange. Mm-hmm. And this leads back to like Point Pleasant with the UFO sightings, which for a while were nightly. There's a road out there called Camp Conley. People would line up out there every night to watch
the UFOs. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm just thinking, like, well, anything with that regularity, all right. I don't. That doesn't sound extraterrestrial to me. That sounds like this is planned, and they're gauging reactions. Mm-hmm. Like, well, was this the beginning of the middle of psychological warfare, where we want to test a small population that's easy to access on a major river? So, it's really easier to spy on. And then also in Point Pleasant was the Defense Logistics Agency, which I don't think anyone's ever mentioned. Like that rang a suspicious bell to me. I'm like, this is right in your town. And it could be argued, well, logistics are not aircraft tests. Logistics is how do you move things around, and the little barges in the Ohio River. But that's in my mind, that's slightly suspicious about what happened in Point Pleasant, because there could have been consultation with other corporations. Like, well, here's this population, and as opposed to what could be said, these were not rednecks and hicks down there. They were people along the Ohio River Valley down there by Point Pleasant and Ravenswood. These are all like high-tech industries with like alloys, ceramics, stuff used in electronics. And some of the Men in Black sightings, they would go around and ask people, well, where are you employed? And other writers have theorized, myself among them, is that, well, some of these Men in Black were going to insurance companies and asking, we need to see blueprints for this ceramics factory on the river near Point Pleasant. And a lot of the MIB stuff, aside from messing with people's minds, could have been basically industrial espionage. to see what's going on with the actual industry there, because the ceramics and the metals were used in aircraft, military aircraft, weaponry, and then the actual place where the first Mothman sighting occurred was the TNT area, where they tested and manufactured dynamite and powder. So it's like that town is it's literally a powder keg to this day of mystery, but in my mind, I think there's more deception than mystery.
So how do you tie in then Mothman with these shady kind of governmental, quasi-governmental, the military-industrial complex, which seems to be alive and well, particularly in that area, and the intelligence apparatus? How does that all tie together, or have you been able to do that?
Well, I wish I had the complete answer, but after scouring that initial report with the 4 teenagers driving around on, November 15th, 66, past this North Power Plant, which it was demolished in the 90s. But anyhow, at the time it was there, an actual power generating plant for all the, because there were factories back there at that time that manufactured the powder and TNT, literally. Mm-hmm. And that was one of their old, it was a factory that had been closed down. And when the kids were driving by it in their, I don't know what it was, a 57 Chevy, I believe, and they first picked up what they thought were like bicycle reflectors. That's how they described the eyes, which, whether or not they were eyes, that's how they were described. Mm-hmm. Just like the logo behind you.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And they saw it standing in a doorway, or moving away from a doorway. And at that point, according to their descriptions, they flipped out and drove into town. And they said they saw the Mothman creature entity on a billboard that they drove by. And myself, having followed that Route 62 in Point Pleasant many times, just like imagining, okay, they had to go here. There was the original sighting was fence surrounded. It's still surrounded by a fence to this day, where the North Power Plant used to be. That's where they drove away from, and then it's called Fairground Roads. They drove to Route 62. That's about a mile drive, and then 7 miles into Point Pleasant. And they went directly to the sheriff's office, which in my mind puts it's not a hoax. You don't go run into the cops, especially if you're a teenager late at night, and say, "Hey, guess what happened to us?"
Mm-hmm. Now, as I recall, so we're not just dealing with these large red eyes or what were perceived to be red eyes, but this thing was huge, and it had a huge wingspan. And it seemed like what I've heard is that when this thing took off, unlike a real bird, it took off more like a helicopter, raising straight up in the air instead of like getting a running start. Is that an accurate part of that story?
Yeah, right. And there are probably 100 witnesses of the actual so-called entity, a handful of which saw it, take off, and it's exactly what they described. Like, they either say like a helicopter, or it seemed to jump and be in the air. And then the wings are all wrong for an actual entity. And John Keel was the first one to say, in order for something that large to fly, which had to have weighed 200, 300 pounds, it would probably require about a 30-foot wingspan. And no one described the wingspan of that extent. But they did describe an actual, we saw some sort of creature or out of place something, and they tried to, there's the Thunderbird theories where there were actual birds and are actual birds, like the condor, which is a huge bird. I think a 12-foot wingspan, 14-foot. But even that didn't quite describe this, because for one thing, they described it as it was a biped. It was moving, described as somewhat clumsily or ponderously. And I'm thinking, well, then whatever that creature was, if it was a creature, it wasn't used to, motivating on its legs. And then the whole how it gets airborne. If you think about an actual, a bird or something, that's not how they get airborne.
No.
So this is another area where, MK Ultra could have been involved with this, one of their sub projects, because another thing they did was they used atomization and they sprayed hallucinogens. And they did it in San Francisco, and just to see what would happen in a small region if it would affect people, and it did. Mm-hmm. So the thing about that is, though, when you boil down to the actual circumstances in Point Pleasant with the kids at the first sighting in their car, that's very unlikely. Like how do you even know where they're going to be, for one thing?
Right. How do you orchestrate that?
Exactly.
Impossible.
You'd have to have somebody in the car with a hypo or something. So it doesn't make any sense. So to me, that still stands out as the strangest thing about everything in Point Pleasant was easily the so-called Mothman sightings, especially that first one, because there were also daylight sightings.
Uh-huh. Are there any stories of the Mothman harming anybody or having? Obviously, it scared people, but I'm talking about attacking people and damaging individuals.
I mean, not to my knowledge, and I've scoured probably 75-80% of what's available out there because there's a lot of repetition. So I went back. I tried to go back to the earliest possible stuff, like newspaper clippings, which, as you might know, there's a Mothman museum in Point Pleasant.
Right.
And you go in there and you want to pass out because there are actual facsimiles of all the newspaper things written by a woman named Mary Heyer.
She was the editor of the newspaper.
Yes. Right. And she was also visited by some very strange characters, men in black types, who in this very broken, weird English that she described as it didn't sound like a foreign language, but more like someone haltingly unfamiliar with how to parse the sentence.
Yeah.
And they were saying, "Do you know John Keel? Do you believe he has seen these things?" And she just got pissed off and said, "I was with him for some of these sightings. These are not aircraft. And would you be willing to, agree that you saw these things?" And well, she's like, "Do you read my newspaper? It's all there." And then they would do funny things like, they wouldn't know what a ballpoint pen was. And other writers have pointed out, well, this is if you want to mess with someone's mind, it's just called cognitive dissonance. It's basically acting very strange in front of someone to scatter their perceptions so they don't know what's going on. And then you will get it's an old technique, it's a brainwash technique or an interrogation technique, which, today it's a lot nastier, of course, like blasting music for days, not to mention physical torture. But in that situation, if someone wanted information from someone like a Mary Heyer, a hardcore news reporter, without making any preconceptions about, it's a small town, she's going to be this little lady and harmless. Not so with her. Keel described her as, she would punch you out if she had to. And she was the only one, like roving reporter in Point Pleasant at that time. There are other people working there in that building, but she'd get in her car and go out wherever they had to go when this was all happening. And most of the witnesses she described, they were just like, they almost always preface, I feel really uncomfortable discussing this, but here's what I saw. And the reaction, of course, is utter terror. No one was harmed, with the exception of, close to it, Virginia Thomas, who had a house in the TNT area, was visiting some friends, and she saw the entity. She was holding her baby, and she saw the entity like rise up behind a car as though it had been laying on the ground. And she dropped her baby, picked it up, and ran into the house. And according to her, the entity stared through the window, and they called the sheriff, and he got out there. Of course, it was gone by then. And there are some clips of her being interviewed, Virginia Thomas. I think the first clip was from the Mothman Festival in 2004, and you can see it in her face when she's talking about. she's friendly, and then when she starts describing the sighting, it's like a different person, where she doesn't want to move her head. She's just standing very still, and there are shots like seeing her a little far away and then closer. And someone who's making up a story, usually they don't repeat it the same way every time. Like, well, the last time he spoke to you, he said this. Now you changed that. But you can tell where the so-called trauma kicks in, because she like gets very rigid. Some of the other witnesses did too. It's like when they talk about that, they never change the story because it's locked into their head, and that just suggests, whatever they saw, it traumatized them. Mm-hmm. And when I was there, practically on every visit, the people, some of the original witnesses would say, they became another person. Some of their lives ruined just because they could not stop thinking about
wow.
And why me? Why did I have to see it? And that was captured brilliantly in the movie by Mark Pellington, The Mothman Prophecies.
With Richard Gere.
Yes. Say what you want about everything else in the movie. They really captured that sense of people felt like they were being surveilled, which is really weird to think about for the 1960s. No one felt like that.
Yeah.
The Cold War was still on, but there was no internet. If you thought like that, you were a genuine paranoid. Right. But these people came to feel like, I feel like something's watching me or following me. These are just everyday people, a cook, a janitor, and they're like, I saw these strange lights in the forest. Well, when they speak about it, they're hushed, like they don't really want to describe it to you, but they do because they feel good sharing it. It's like it makes the fear lessen itself, diminishes the fear.
I've got kind of an obvious question. You were referring to the logo that I have on my Zoom background. Where the heck did the term Mothman come from? Because that doesn't look like any moth I've ever seen.
No, it's a clumsy term, I think. I don't know the person's name, but I think it originates with a witness describing it as the color of a moth, like a kind of a dusty grayish black. And then the reporters who rushed into Point Pleasant because they heard, they love anything sensational. So this, just like now, this will get clicks. Back then, this will sell newspapers. So they were interviewing those teenagers. Actually, some of them got to the police station, I think, in the morning, and they were talking to the sheriff, and I think they confused, they described it as the color of a moth, which became moth-like, and then
Mothman.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of if you look at the early news reports, the clippings, and there are tons of them online, it's described as the Birdman. It's not called Mothman until I think like a few days after the first so-called sightings.
So is there a clear chronology or timeline of independent corroboration of this particular form, or was it, how did the Mothman mythology, for lack of a better term, evolve? Was it just from these teenagers first? It kind of took off and people started seeing the same thing, or were there independent, witnesses who described the same thing that gives you confidence that there was an entity that was making appearance, or multiple maybe, but at least a defined entity that fit this description? How likely is it that it just kind of snowballed and turned into, hey, I think I saw something weird, it must have been the Mothman?
I think there's a high possibility of snowballing effect where the general mindset, being in a small town like that, is, hey, you hear about this? And if the first thing they would have heard would have been the initial Mothman sighting at the old power plant. And there weren't many houses, well, there aren't now even. I think there were like 2 or 3 houses in that actual area, which is this vast, I think it's 5,000 acres, the so-called TNT area, the McClintock wildlife area, it's called now. I'm almost positive that a lot of the sightings were there's a certain type of owl around that area. So a lot of them almost had to be owl sightings.
That's even because I just read a really good book about owls, the Watchers. Is that what it's called? There's a handful of books that have really stuck with me. Disturbing. Mothman Prophecies is one of them. Dan lent it to me, I don't know, like 10 years ago. And it disturbed me to the core because of that psychological aspect that Bill is bringing up in various forms. And then, but the owl, the Watchers, is that right? Does that sound right, Dan?
That sounds like right. And I think the author's name is like McClelland or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, and I read that's another one. And just because you brought up owls as a messenger type intermediary between this world and
right, and the other realms.
It's interesting that you bring up the owl as potentially a part of this whole mystery too, which really makes it even more complicated. But I understand what you're saying. It's a known species in that particular area, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and some of which were pretty big because a farmer shot one, and there's a photo. It's got to be online where I think he's holding it. He has like the wings stretched, and it looks to be maybe a 5-foot wingspan. So if you saw the thing on the ground, and let's face it, you don't really see owls walking around on the ground. Mm-hmm. It probably would have been about 3 feet tall. But if you saw it in a tree, maybe 10 feet off the ground at night, it would freak you out. And there was, I don't know if you've heard of this one, there were the Flatwoods, West Virginia sightings in 1952.
Is that the Flatwoods Monster?
Yes.
In UFO? Yeah, okay.
And another figure from that area, questionable figure, who still wrote some great books, was Gray Barker. And he went to Flatwoods, which is Flatwoods is like east of Point Pleasant. I'm guessing here. I'm thinking it's about 100 miles east. It's way out there. And these kids described like a Mothman type figure, but far stranger. They described it as like 12 feet tall, with glowing eyes and like a dome or something, and a cloak. And then Gray Barker went down there, and he himself, who was known to be a bit of a hoaxer, right? And when you hear that about a so-called, a researcher, you got to really be careful, because even once, if you're caught hoaxing, forget it. There's no credibility. But in his case, he did so much work and asked so many sensitive and intelligent questions about these witnesses that he cared enough about, okay, I really want to find out what's going on here. But if I can't get that answer, I might do this. And that's not good. But that was kind of like a precursor. And the thing that I find interesting is that, there's a West Virginia sighting. And these people didn't sound like rubes. But then when you bring, these were kids who saw this, right? Did an adult see it? Well, there was a woman involved whose last name is May, and I think that she said that she also saw it, and then that they saw UFOs, and then at that point, the narrative breaks off, and you've got like people being interviewed saying, "Well, I saw this and that," and then the astronomical data line up again with Venus, and in 1953, also a very bright Mars was intensely bright. If you're not used to seeing either of those, like through trees, you can have all kinds of confabulatory things going on, because once you become frightened, then your imagination takes over, and it connects the dots for you. Basically, it's projection.
So possible explanations for what Mothman really was ranged from owls. Seemed like to me I heard a sandhill crane was a possible explanation for Mothman. Those two, and maybe some kind of weird chemical leakage from the TNT area that could have caused hallucinogenic types of things. What else out there beside a truly paranormal creature? What else out there would reasonably explain Mothman?
Well, one of the most interesting I read was, and this came out in a magazine called Soldier of Fortune, and I can't remember who brought it up. It was online, and it said, "Is Mothman explained?" Of course, I got to see this. And they were. See, the thing is, I don't remember if there was like backup documentation on this. Like, okay, where did you, whoever's telling this story, where did you hear this? You know, the whole chain of evidence thing. But the description was of an Army test over the Point Pleasant area, over the TNT area, because it was so huge. They were doing high altitude, low open parachute testing. To train soldiers, okay, to free fall and not open the chute until the last possible moment because you won't be sighted by the enemy. So supposedly that's an alternate explanation for Mothman, because the soldiers had phosphorescent paint around their eyes.
Oh.
And one of them landed and was described as getting stuck in a fence. This parachute got stuck in a fence, and he was trying to pull it out and spreading his arms out and going like this, and reporting seeing a vehicle with his headlights splash across it. He had to report this back to whoever was in charge of the operation. And that story in Soldier of Fortune, you should really look it up, just like Soldier of Fortune, Mothman, will probably bring it up. And I thought about that. I'm like, well, they describe the eyes. They're describing reflective, but they describe them like bicycle reflectors, just like the picture behind you. So that's the only one it's like, well, that sounds pretty, that's interesting to think about that. Instead of, all this other buildup around it, because that's what happens is, there's confabulation, and then the confabulation becomes so detailed and layered, trying to strip back down to the original, you're like, oh God, I'd rather, chew my own foot off.
Well, then you have the intentional introduction of misinformation or disinformation, which is comes with any of these subjects that makes it almost. I mean, you have to be a bulldog of a reporter, or insane, or obsessed with the topic in order to weed through all the garbage to find even something we can agree on.
Sure, or be independently wealthy and go check this stuff out. Because even both you guys, I think, have experience in this, like ghost hunting and stuff like that. I mean, that's expensive. Even just like, okay, let's say you're doing one day, you're doing an overnight. You gotta pay for food, you gotta pay for gas, incidentals, your equipment.
Employees, if you think big, you get employees, but yeah, good luck.
Yeah, exactly. Then you have payroll.
So there's one figure we haven't talked about that's always kind of interesting to me. So we had UFO phenomena, we had this Mothman creature, we had the Men in Black. In the movie, and I don't remember this so much as John Keel's book, they talk about a character named Indrid Cole.
Oh,
so
right.
What, who or what is that?
I'm actually glad you brought that up, as strange as it is, because out of all those things that apparently happened near Point Pleasant and in the Indrid Cole story, it's almost too much to conceptualize. That story is based on a guy driving on Interstate, I think it's 77 South, near Parkersburg, West Virginia, which is about 75 miles north of Point Pleasant. So about 75 miles from here, too. And he described being paced by a gray cylindrical, he described it like a chimney that goes over a gas lantern, bell-shaped, and that this vehicle pulled in front of him and went sideways and blocked the road. He didn't describe any sound, but he had to stop his truck and get out. And that's where he said this guy came up to his truck. He rolled down the window, and he said the man had his hands under his arms like this, had a trench coat on, and just asked him, like the I mean, they're not strange questions, but in context, after, this vehicle's in front of him, he's asking him, what is that over there? He was pointing towards the city with its lights. And, in the movie, his name's Gordon, told him, well, that's a city. It's Parkersburg. And what is your purpose? What are you doing? And this guy had a truck full of, I think, used appliances. He was just driving home. Derenberger was his name. Woodrow Derenberger.
Well, yeah, Woody Derenberger. Yeah.
Woody Derenberger. And there's a book out there. I think his daughter wrote it about this whole thing. And the character talking to him near the truck, called himself Cold, Injured Cold, which in and of itself, that's a very strange name. I even try to look that up. What sort of name is that? Injured. Well, it's it could be Swedish, could be Dutch, but then when you combine it with a word like cold, it's almost as though, okay, if you wanted to really play with someone's head, call yourself that. A nonsense name, act menacing, have slick back hair, do it during the rain, and there are other witnesses at least witnesses to him talking to Derenberger, this guy standing outside the truck. So that in and of itself, that's like the high strangeness meter is met there. Well, what was that for? And what was it? Is there an actual connection between that and Mothman?
And
in the movie, it makes it look like there's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
To what end would that, be a part of a strategy to pull over on the highway? And I mean, you just hoping this guy's daughter goes and writes a book in 30 years or something? I mean, yeah. What do you get out?
Exactly. It's like, again, you cannot create this stuff. It's if you try to, if me because I, most of what I write is horror fiction.
Yeah.
Speculative fiction. If I tried to make something up and that was my scenario, I'd read it and go, this is the worst dreck. And that's the problem with most of the Mothman.
Yeah, that's why it's so interesting. It's because it just doesn't seem to have. There's nothing you can hang your hat on. It's just
right.
How do I interpret any of this? And that's what freaked me out so much about the book, especially if you could talk about some of the phone calls.
Yes,
the metallic, weird sounds.
I mean, that'll drive you insane anyway, but, as part of a larger, bizarre world, that really, for some reason, that's what I remember the most from the story, is the strange phone calls and the clicking or whatever it was.
And those were phone calls that Keel got himself?
Yeah, wasn't it? He got...
Yeah, Keel got some in New York City. And then he also... He was investigating people who had received him at Point Pleasant because they're describing the same thing. And I wrote it down to make sure I remember to talk about this. And he just called it the numbers game, where someone would pick up their phone and there would be this rapid fire reading off 58, 73, 27, or alternately it would be someone who sounded like they had an accent, usually described as Spanish. No racism meant by that. But that, when Keel talked to some of there was a woman in particular who every day would get a phone call. And she said, it's this man reading numbers to me, and I don't know what he wants. He sounds Spanish. And, decades later, I think 2008 or 9, there was a writer who wrote an article about that because he himself had received one of these calls. I'm like, okay, I have to read this. And it turns out that, I don't know what year, but closer to our present time, that this was a technique used by drug runners. And it was also a technique used by spies who would call someone a contact and read off a series of numbers and hang up. And of course, the contact would know what those numbers meant. They meant, 15 meant go here, 73 meant go talk to this person, and that's it. And then as far as getting back to MK Ultra, it's also a brainwash technique, or a way for post-hypnotic recall, where a person who has already been so-called conditioned is called,
triggered,
a sleeper, right, triggered to do something, and by hearing a set of numbers, it can turn them on or it can turn them off. And these sorts of calls were prevalent in Point Pleasant. And then you have to ask, well, why? Why would they call just a normal person? And then you can only theorize, well, again, this is part of cognitive dissonance, trying to play with people's minds. How paranoid can we make people in one location? Can we make them believe something? Yeah. And that's a whole other part of MK Ultra, where they were testing belief systems. What would it take to make someone believe in, an invasion was happening or an invasion wasn't happening? And to me, those still seem to stand up. Like, what could possibly explain all this strangeness in one place? Yeah. Men in black, some of whom are going to insurance companies and asking for blueprints. Why? And the ridiculous stuff. It's almost like, as Keel said, the MIB acted so weird because when people reported them, they wouldn't be believed. They'd say they asked you for this, and then they wanted to sell you a magazine subscription. Really?
Okay.
How much bourbon did you have that night?
Yeah.
Well, not, that goes on today with propaganda, where part of it's true, but then it's fed into some other stuff that's totally idiotic, and you're like, "Oh, get out of here."
Mm.
And it's interesting that people who tuned into the show to learn about cryptids may be either disappointed or pleasantly surprised that it's really potentially even deeper than that in terms of what the enormity of the program that apparently was in place. Now, you could bring in another aspect, which is that of the entities or another intelligence or the UFO occupants or whoever you want to talk about, having influence from not within but without or outside. There's always that possibility that it's bigger than just an MK Ultra type experiment, as big as that is, and that's a story also. But I wonder what truly paranormal or the UFO side, alien intelligence. Bill, could you talk about that? I mean, what either leads you to think that that's a possibility or to rule it out, if either?
I don't know. I'm hesitant, like, across the board when it comes to UFOs. To I can speculate all I want. Like, well, could they be extraterrestrial? Well, the thing is, well, they could. I mean, that's just what a waste of space if we're the only ones in this galaxy. And then, of course, there are hundreds of millions of galaxies. And then there's a definite possibility we live in a multiverse. So that's not even big enough. Well, out of all that, it's almost certain, we are not alone. But then the real big question is, okay, well, that's almost a given, but it's not a given that we've been visited. We may have been surveilled, because now we're detecting all these Earth-like planets, where assuming that they would have to be entities that breathe air and need water, if they were not silicon-based or something. If they were just carbon-based like us, that's the thing. They almost certainly exist, but have they been here? And even if they did get here, as Jacques Vallée said, what the behaviors these entities reported performing are so outrageously absurd and ridiculous. Like that's how he was refuting the Strieber abduction report. So, like, why would these advanced aliens come here, extraterrestrials, and perform these astoundingly cruel tests that any medical student could pull off in 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Why would you don't have to traumatize people to get this information? So why was it done that way? And then, unfortunately, that brings in the whole conspiracy thing. Like, well, this was a black op, and it was made, the alien abduction thing is another cover for experimentation. Because once a person starts saying, I was, abducted from my bedroom or out in the woods, game over for someone who's serious minded. They're going to go, no, that can't be what happened. Something else happened. So to answer your question, that there almost certainly have to be other beings out there. Really, I mean, why? I mean, beyond why anything exists in all this space, though, they have to be there. But it's a question of what's actually been here and shown up.
And my contention, as far as that goes, would be that it's probably even more complicated than just there's some beings visiting from somewhere. I mean, again, going back to the whole black budget idea, the quasi-governmental, intelligence. We have 18 intelligence agencies that we know of in this country alone, I
That
think.
we know of, right?
And where the merger, the nexus between what we call government, at least the known government, and industry is, I mean, it's a black hole for not just money, but knowledge in terms of the rest of us, for sure. But even the people who know something about it don't know everything about it, not even close.
Everything is compartmentalized.
Yeah. So
I mean, even officially, just to protect like official,
right,
like chemical formulas or whatever.
and I suspect that a lot of this real high strangeness stuff, as you hint at, is not because it's aliens from Zeta Reticuli coming to, screw around with our heads. How tough would that be? It'd be like us going to the zoo and poking sticks at the bears or something.
Just show up,
It's only fun for so long, but so I suspect that some of this stuff is generated within that area for who knows, what reasons. Experiments, tests, because people are just cruel. I don't know, but
yeah, that's almost certainly part of it. There, every human being has a monstrous element. This is something psychologists know, that they don't necessarily. They're not going to talk. If you're a patient, they're not going to say, "Well, Dan and Dave, you've got a monstrous part to your personality."
Yeah.
And you'll go, "No, I do not. I'm a nice guy."
Yeah.
If you strip someone down to what should be common sense, not stripping someone down, but if you deconstruct, consciousness and the personality, the last thing left is fear and survival.
Mm-hmm.
So
brain.
yeah.
Animal brain.
Hey, I want to be cognizant of the fact that we've had Bill captive here for about an hour and a half, so we don't want to run too far over our time limit. Maybe, Bill, we impose upon you sometime in a not too distant future to come back and talk to us about. I have some more questions about John Keel, and you wrote a chapter on Roswell, did you not, in your book?
Yeah, there's a short chapter in there.
Yeah, I think we'd be interested in talking to you some more about those topics. Dave, is there anything else that you wanted to ask here?
I just want to ask the hardest question of them all, and that is to ask Bill, after all this time you spent and effort, what have you concluded, if anything, about the Mothman phenomenon?
And to connect with that, the issue of whether the Mothman caused the collapse of the Silver Bridge was an omen to portend the collapse of the Silver Bridge, or how all that came together from what you know.
Synchronicity in the ether or something? I mean, what's your view on that?
As far as connecting the bridge collapse to it, I think that was just a horribly tragic thing that happened, because I've also studied the history of the bridge. And that bridge was built, I think, in 1925 or 1920, and it was not built to withstand the kind of loads of the 1960s and the 70s, or not the 70s, the 50s and the 60s, when that whole area down there really opened up to industry, manufacturing on the Ohio River. And that bridge, the Silver Bridge, at the time, that was the only way to get from Ohio to West Virginia. Otherwise, you would have had to driven to, I think it's Ravenswood, West Virginia, which would have been, or is, I think it's about a 34 or 35 mile drive. And to someone going to work right across the river, now I have to drive here to get here, which is what ended up happening, of course. But the bridge, when they finally recovered what they could out of the river, they did find one of those giant metal discs that has a bolt in the middle, and it was cracked, but it was actually broken in half. And this is an official determination from, I guess it's the National Transportation Safety Board, where that this particular pin here, this broke. It had been apparently cracked for a long time because there was rust in the crack. And then on that, it was like 5 o'clock in the evening on December 15th, 67, there were all these Christmas shoppers, cars on that bridge, and that's what overloaded it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reporter, Mary Heyer, her office was probably like 100 feet from the on-ramp. She says when that collapsed, she thought that there had either been a sonic boom or there had been an attack, because that's how intense the sound of it was, like rumbled the ground. And it's almost unimaginable to try and, just even to imagine how horrible that was when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again,
Some 50 people died too, right?
Yeah, it's like
Somewhere
40,
around there.
40 something, and then I think two bodies were never recovered, but everyone else was accounted for.
So what then would you say is your summary of the Mothman experience? I mean, have you concluded anything?
Well,
that it was really weird.
Two things that try though I might, because I'm someone who's I know I'm not alone in this. I'm really bothered when I can't wrap my head around something completely, because I like to think, well, okay, I know science, I know how to access science that I don't know about, and you do this, you add this, 2 and 2 is 4, there's your answer. Well, in the Mothman series, that can only go so far, and then you're into the deep strangeness, and then I tried to blur the deep strangeness into, okay, well, it had to be, they were being messed with. This was a test. This was a testing place by humans on humans for horrible reasons, national security, the early days of, and that explains this and that. But even Keel said that he got a message before the bridge collapsed that there was going to be, and in the movie, there's going to be a great tragedy on the River Ohio. He actually got that message and contacted Mary Heyer, the news reporter, and told her that. He said, do not share this with anyone. But this is another message I got, and maybe nothing. And then the bridge collapses. So, of course, your mind's going to go, or Keel's mind, okay, well, that's the great tragedy. That's what it was. Mm-hmm. He thought it was going to be an explosion of a factory on the river. And, again, the movie did a good job of that. Richard Gere is flipping out. He's like, I got to get there. Something's going to happen. No, everybody's like, you're crazy, man. And then the bridge collapses, and that's pretty much it. Like, well, that was it. And that's the one thing where, that sounds like that actually was a prophecy.
So he got a message from where?
It was a phone call, one of the strange phone voices, where John Keel, he found out eventually that Gray Barker, the other guy in West Virginia, well, Keel was in New York, that Gray Barker had been calling people, other UFO investigators, and just screwing with their heads. Weird sound effects and stuff like that. So Keel's thinking, okay, it's Gray Barker. And so after a point, he just drove to West Virginia and confronted Barker and said, are you doing this stuff? Because if you are, you might be hurting people. You got to stop this. Not to mention it's not legal. And the weird phone calls persisted after that. And then Keel was able to track down Barker's whereabouts. Back then, I don't know how he did it, because you didn't have an internet. You had a telephone. But given that Barker owned a movie theater, he was able to track down, okay, he was here trying to pick up these films. So there was no mobile phones. So he couldn't, he couldn't pin all this on Gray Barker. It was just, for one thing, it was too creative. Mm-hmm. And then from what people described, and then from what Keel himself described, too strange, these phone calls. But whatever they did, they definitely had the cognitive dissonance effect where, okay, now my mind is screwed with, I don't know what to believe. And that may have been the ultimate goal, really. It had nothing to do with, trying to create a creature, or it was testing how far can you break down a person's belief system or create one. And I mean, that to me, that's scarier than any of the stuff, even an entity sighting.
Yeah.
Like, wow, people want to know how far can we take a person? And like you said earlier, that's the stuff we know about.
Right. So it could have been a PSYOPs thing.
Yeah. One of the things you said, and excuse me, Dave, go ahead.
Did it have an end where it seemed to end, or do weird things still happen in that region? And the fact that you pointed out that it's central to, these intelligence setups is really, in my mind now, a key part of the picture. And I don't know that I thought that before I talked to you. I kind of thought, well, maybe, that's kind of interesting coincidence, I guess. But now it seems to me also to be central to the story. So did it seem like the experiment ended, if that's what this is?
Well, as people often say on these shows, that's an interesting question. Not that your previous ones weren't, but after the bridge collapse, there were, I personally could not find any more, at least like public record accounts of, well, there was another weird sighting in the TNT area of the so-called Birdman and the Mothman. Those I couldn't find anymore, but there were still UFO reports. And that strikes me as, well, okay, if this was, some psychological operation here and it ended, I'm not saying it ended with the bridge, because that was just a horrible coincidence. And in the, worst possible way, the bridge was in bad shape. It was overloaded and it collapsed.
Yeah.
But then with there was a UFO flap in the Northeast United States in 1973. And there are reports coming from Police, which is right across the river from Point Pleasant. And that was also a so-called hotbed of sightings before the Mothman sighting. Of the bright lights, and people right across the river is the TNT area where the Mothman sightings were. So people in Cheshire and Gallipolis as they pronounce it, they are reporting lights over there. So they were seeing whatever staged operation or actual unidentified flying objects. That I'm not saying they were extraterrestrial, but again, you can't ever rule that out 100%. That's why I'm very skeptical, critical minded, but never to the point where I'd say, no, there can't be, extraterrestrial UFOs or visitations, because there can be. I think it's a very slim chance, but you can't 100% just turn off, because then you're not open anymore.
Yeah. So the strangeness has continued.
Well, I think there have been. I've seen pictures. Now, I don't know if they look exactly like the Mothman, but during the collapse of on the collapse of the World Trade Center in 9/11, and even in Chicago, I think I've seen some reports of Mothman type sightings. Now, whether or not it's the same thing that's on Point Pleasant or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I did hear about the Chicago sightings. Those sound almost precisely like what people describe in Point Pleasant. It's like the same size of a figure, a winged figure. So I mean, who knows? Because these days, it's almost impossible to fake like an actual you standing outside and you see something right in daylight. People could fake that, but if you have any kind of critical thinking, you're going to go, I didn't just see a 20-foot wingspan bird, did I? Because birds look a certain way.
Right.
People have done just to mess around. Like I've seen some pictures of, there's probably a hang glider, decorated, but it was photographed from a distance. Now, if you just gave it a cursory glance, you'd go, wow, that's a strange image there. Is that one of those thunderbirds or what? But yeah, the Chicago area, I don't know if it's still going on, but there were some strange reports from there. And then further up, along the Mississippi River, more towards Minnesota, there were some high strangeness reports up there of large creatures. And then they brought out the Thunderbird theory again about, these really immensely big birds. And they had, I think it was someone from Smithsonian saying, well, there's never been a condor sighting in America. But it's not out of the question, because the condor could be in It could be 10 below zero. It could be 100 degrees. They're not reliant on environment. But yeah, it keeps going.
One of the things you said in your book that I really appreciated, I think, was a reference to that poster that I used to have from the X-Files. I want to believe, when Fox Mulder said that, and you said, I'd like to change that to I want to understand. And that
Yes.
that really resonated with me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's how I still feel about it. I don't want to believe, because belief is, it's like not to get too deep into the religious aspect, but I think that once you rely on faith, you stop thinking, and then once you stop thinking, you can be manipulated. Yeah. Because that manipulator is going to know, okay, here's the trigger for this person. All I have to do is trash this belief, and they're not thinking anymore. But regarding paranormal stuff, yeah, that's the only way I can look at it. I don't want to believe it. I want to find out. I want to understand it, which are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
Then one,
so.
You actually understand, as I said before, it's really simple. 2 and 2 does equal 4. Okay, that's a fact. So I believe that. That's not a belief system. That's a fact.
And the last thing I'd like to say is that Bill's an excellent writer. Just reading the few pages that were on Amazon, I was like, wow, this guy knows how to write. So, you want to read a well-written book, check out
Blacklight.
the title.
Thank you.
Title, the new.
Thank you. I think I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker.
Oh, I don't know about that.
No, but it's two different skills for sure.
Oh, definitely.
I tend to speak like I write also. It takes me a long time to compose stuff in my head before I say it. But that's because I like writing and I consider myself a good writer. But, there are other much more interesting speakers who can paint pictures and, use emotion better in the speaking. That's a great skill, of course. But writing is very difficult to master.
Oh, it is.
And your book is very well written. So I'd like to say, people, that's something to, when you see that, you should appreciate it and take it in. So, but what's the title again?
Of the nonfiction book?
The Blacklight. I think that's what
Blacklight Perspectives on Mysterious Phenomena.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can get that at Amazon or
yes,
Barnes & Noble or any place like that.
And also an ebook.
Ebook too, yeah. Cool.
The paperback is only $9.99, so it's a good deal.
Yeah, it is
I also use cars, but you got books.
It goes for a good purpose. Bill, thanks again. This has just been a delight for me, and I'm not kidding. We'd like to have you back maybe sometime when the weather improves, and you can talk to us about UFOs and Roswell and whatever other paranormal penguins or whatever you want to talk about.
I'd be happy to. It's enjoyable to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, it is.
It always is, especially when the two guys who are so obviously interested in stuff and not just, you're not sensationalizing. Because
no. We want to understand also. That's
right. Let's face it, you don't need to sensationalize this stuff. It is what it is.
Sensational, right?
To
begin with. Well, have a happy New Year or a Merry Christmas, and maybe we'll get to talk to you in 2021.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Okay, Bill, appreciate it.
Good night, Bill.